Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are looking at what the author of our source material describes as a crime scene. But the twist here is that the victim is Western civilization itself.
Yeah, and according to the book we're covering today, it wasn't murdered by some external enemy. It is actively committing suicide.
Right, which is a really heavy premise. Honestly, this is probably the most confrontational text we've ever tackled on the show. We are diving into a book titled Suicide of Western Civilization.
Ugh.
Thanatos of Raging Marxist, Feminist, Misandrist, Female Supremacy
Quite the title.
by Conrad Riker. And right off the bat, I mean, if that title doesn't tell you this is going to be an intense ride, nothing will.
Definitely not. And just to set the stage for you, the listener, Riker frames this entire book as a field manual. It isn't written for the general public who are just happy with the status quo. It is written specifically for what he calls the red-pilled man.
Yeah, the guy who looks around at society, sees the rot, sees the confusion, and really wants to understand the mechanics under the hood.
Exactly. He is arguing that we are being strangled by a very specific ideology, and he pulls absolutely no punches. Look, before we unpack that ideology, and trust me, we are going to go incredibly deep into the history of institutional capture today, I want to remind everyone listening that if you enjoy these deep dives where we tackle controversial and frankly difficult topics that other shows might avoid, please make sure to like and subscribe right now.
Yes, please hit that button so you don't miss out. It really helps us keep this operation going so we can bring you these uncensored analyses.
And a quick note on impartiality. Our mission today is to impartially report on the content provided in this book. Riker's work contains highly politically charged content, touching on both left-wing and right-wing themes, but we are not taking any sides. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, we are simply conveying the ideas contained in the original source material.
Right, we are just the messengers here, peeling back the layers of his arguments. And we're going ultra long today because Riker covers a massive amount of ground. We're talking about the history of how our institutions were captured by feminists and Marxists, the psychology behind what he calls the woke mind virus, and the antidote he proposes for men.
And for those of you who want to follow along, because there are a lot of specific data points and historical references we're going to cover, you need to go to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book immediately.
Yeah, check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books if you want the full text to verify what we were saying. That is where you go.
So let's start with the foundation. Riker opens up a front he calls the language war.
The language war, right?
He argues that the first battlefield isn't physical, it is linguistic. He says that the words we hear every day in corporate emails or on the news, words like justice and compassion, have been completely hijacked.
Which is crucial to his entire thesis. Because he points out that if you control the language, you control the thought process. And he says the biggest weapon in this arsenal is the word equity.
Right. Now, to the average person, equity sounds like fairness. It sounds noble, like everyone getting a fair shake.
But Riker argues it's actually a tool for sabotage. He distinguishes it sharply from equality of opportunity. He says equity is about enforced mediocrity. It's about forcing the exact same outcome, regardless of effort or skill.
And he gives that striking example from Minneapolis public schools to illustrate what this looks like in practice. This was back in 2020.
Right.
Riker notes that the school district used the concept of equity to justify lowering math standards for minority students. They framed it as compassion, claiming traditional testing was a barrier. But Riker just calls it soft bigotry.
Yeah, he says that by gutting excellence to manufacture equal outcomes, you're actually destroying the potential of the very people you claim to help. You aren't lifting the bottom up, you are tearing the top down.
And it gets even more extreme when he talks about higher ed. He mentions Harvard courses on decolonized math, where the idea that 2 + 2 = 5 is treated as a valid perspective for oppressed peoples.
I mean, for a logical thinker, that is just brain-breaking. How do you even argue with that?
Well, Riker says it is meant to be brain-breaking. That is the design.
Yeah.
And he doesn't just call it random internet madness. He traces this tactic back to a specific intellectual lineage, the Frankfurt School.
Yes, the Frankfurt
Cool.
School.
Yeah.
Let's dig into that because he points specifically to Herbert Marcuse and the doctrine of repressive tolerance.
Right, repressive tolerance. It sounds like an oxymoron. It sounds like something straight out of 1984.
That's exactly the point Riker makes. Marcuse argued that to achieve true liberation from the status quo, you have to tolerate the left, but actively repress the right.
So silencing dissent, specifically conservative or traditional dissent, is reframed as liberation.
Right, so when you see speakers deplatformed or shouted down on college campuses or canceled for 10-year-old tweets, Riker says that isn't a glitch in the system. That is repressive tolerance in action. It is the playbook.
So, when people say we need to be inclusive, Riker argues they actually mean we need to exclude anyone who disagrees with the revolutionary agenda.
Exactly. And they hide this repression behind what he calls the compassion mask. This really stuck out to me in the reading. He argues that concepts like safetyism and inclusion are Trojan horses used to destroy competence hierarchies.
Yeah, if you can frame competence or standards as unsafe or exclusionary, you can dismantle them completely.
And he uses a very visceral visual to prove this point. The poop map of Seattle versus the clean streets of Singapore.
Yeah, that image is hard to shake.
Walk us through the comparison he's making there because it's pretty shocking.
Well, Raker's argument is that Singapore represents a society with strict order and hierarchy, what he would characterize as a functioning patriarchy. You break the law, there are severe consequences, and the result is that it's clean, safe, and highly functional.
Right. Seattle, on the other hand, in his view, represents the hysteria of this compassion-based governance. In that system, enforcing standards against vagrancy or public drug use is seen as mean or oppressive.
So you end up with an actual map tracking human waste on the sidewalks because the city refuses to impose order.
Exactly. It is a stark contrast between order and chaos.
Straight.
And he also throws a pretty hard jab at the hypocrisy of the elites pushing this chaos. He mentions AOC's Tax the Rich dress at the Met Gala,
Oh, yeah.
a $58,000 ticket event, and she's wearing a designer dress to protest wealth. Riker calls it proletariat cosplay.
Which highlights the massive disconnect between the people pushing these ideologies and the reality on the ground. But Riker goes deeper than just the politics of it. He thinks this ideology is actually a pathology.
Yeah, he calls it the woke mind virus. But he grounds it in very specific psychological traits.
This is where the book gets incredibly controversial and where he really speaks directly to that red-pilled manosphere audience. He claims that leftism, particularly this brand of it, runs on female neuroticism and borderline personality traits, BPD.
And he's not just using those terms as insult. He actually cites medical data for this.
Right. He references NIH data regarding the use of psychiatric medications. The text points out that far-left activists are shown to use psychiatric meds at triple the rate of normal adults.
Triple the rate.
Yeah. And Riker connects this chemical dependency to the behavior we see in protests. The emotional volatility, the screaming, the complete inability to regulate emotions. He argues that we have handed the keys to civilization over to people who are, clinically speaking, unstable.
He calls them NPC zombies, non-player characters, which is a gaming term for background characters who just recite pre-programmed lines. And he brings up a Stanford study regarding Black Lives Matter protesters to back this up.
That study was fascinating to read about. It found that 83% of the protesters couldn't actually define systemic racism when they were asked.
83%. So they were chanting a slogan, screaming for justice, but they couldn't even define the terms they were using.
Right, and Riker interprets that as ideological possession. They aren't thinking critically, they are just executing a script. They're infected with the virus.
And he ties this possession back to what he calls the terrible mother archetype. This is such an interesting concept in the book, the state acting as a surrogate mommy.
Exactly. Riker posits that in a healthy society, you have a balance of paternal and maternal energies. The paternal energy sets boundaries, enforces rules, and challenges you. The maternal energy nurtures and protects.
But he argues the modern state has become a devouring mother. It confiscates wealth from the predators who he identifies as productive men to feed the infants, or the state dependents.
It creates a dynamic where the citizen is never actually allowed to grow up.
So it creates this smothering governance style. He mentions universities providing coloring books and puppies for students who are traumatized by hearing opposing viewpoints, literally treating young adults like toddlers.
It's pure infantilization. And Riker says if you challenge that dynamic, if you try to act like an adult and speak the truth, you get hit with emotional incontinence. This is where tone policing comes in.
Right, tone police.
If you present a fact, say about biology or crime statistics, and it causes discomfort, the activist claims you have committed violence. The fact itself isn't disputed. The feeling it caused is treated as the crime.
Like the Evergreen State College incident he talks about.
Precisely. That is his perfect case study. Biology professors were mobbed and physically threatened simply for citing basic chromosomes and refusing to leave campus during a day of absence based on their race.
And Riker points out that in this worldview, feelings always trump facts. If reality hurts my feelings, reality is labeled hate speech.
And who is the primary target of this? Riker is very clear throughout the text. It is a war on men. Specifically, he calls it a war on competence.
He argues that meritocracy, the idea that the best person gets the job, regardless of who they are, is now considered male-coded. Because it's hierarchical, it's competitive, it distinguishes winners from losers.
So the ideology seeks to dismantle meritocracy entirely because it naturally favors those masculine traits.
And he brings up the airline industry as a terrifying, real-world example of this. He talks about United Airlines prioritizing diversity goals in pilot hiring over strict competence metrics.
Riker asks the listener a very direct question. Do you want a pilot who checked a diversity box or the one who aced every single flight simulation?
He links this directly to the recent spike in near misses on runways. It's a frightening application of the theory. When you prioritize identity over skill in literal life or death situations, you invite disaster.
He calls this the suicide in real time. We are trading public safety and competence for ideological purity. But he also looks at the personal lives of men, which brings us to the dating market and what he calls sexual socialism.
This part of the book was a massive eye-opener. He dives into the dating market dynamics using data from apps like Tinder. He cites data showing that 80% of women are competing for the top 10 to 20% of men.
The chads, essentially.
Right. And they label the rest of the men, the vast majority of normal guys, as toxic, low value, or they just treat them as completely invisible.
Riker notes the profound paradox here. Feminism promised sexual liberation and freedom, but the result, according to the data he presents, is a system where a few alpha males hoard all the intimacy, while the majority of men are left with absolutely nothing.
And he says young men are checking out because of this. They look at the family courts, what he calls the cash and prizes system of divorce, where he claims the system heavily incentivizes breaking up families for financial profit.
And they look at the Me Too era and the complete loss of due process for men, and they just say, I'm out. I am not participating.
That is the MGTOW movement, men going their own way.
Exactly. Riker claims 72% of young men are effectively voting with their feet to avoid what he calls gynocentric tyranny. They aren't marrying, they aren't dating, and they aren't participating in a society that they feel actively hates them.
He frames this not as giving up, but as a rational, calculated strike.
Yeah.
Men are going on strike.
And Riker argues this inevitably leads to demographic suicide. This is a very heavy chapter. He talks about abortion not just as a moral or religious issue, but as civilizational warfare.
He calls it the abortion holocaust. He cites a staggering figure of 1.8 billion aborted globally since Roe v. Wade.
To Riker, this isn't about healthcare at all. It is a form of civilizational self-loathing. He says a civilization that kills its own future is a civilization that actively wants to die. This is the Thanatos, the death drive that he mentions right at the title of the book.
He paints a really bleak picture of the consequences of this. Empty cribs, a society of isolated cat ladies, and the state stepping in to replace the family unit entirely.
It is the ultimate victory of that terrible mother state we talked about. If there are no fathers and no families, the state becomes the only parent.
Right.
It relies on a population that has no other allegiance. You don't have a clan, you don't have a church, you don't have a family, you just have the state.
So we have a grim diagnosis here. We've got institutional capture, a weaponized language war, a psychological virus, and a demographic collapse. It feels overwhelming to read. But Riker claims this is a field manual, which means he does offer an antidote.
He does, and the antidote starts with a massive call to action for men. He says the solution is absolutely not to negotiate with this ideology. You cannot negotiate with a pathology. You cannot reason with a virus.
You have to rebuild strength.
Exactly. You have to rebuild strength. He talks about entirely rejecting the victimhood narrative. He is highly critical of the modern happiness cult, this idea that the only goal of life is just to be happy and practice self-care.
Yeah, he wants men to trade self-care for stoicism and duty. He suggests putting down the therapy speak and picking up Winston Churchill or Marcus Aurelius.
He argues that men are forged in fire, not in a therapist's office talking about their feelings. He believes men need to rediscover the capacity to endure suffering for a higher purpose. The goal of life isn't to feel good, it's to be good at being a man.
And he gives a great real-world example of this in action. The Brotherhood Garage in Detroit.
Yes. This is his example of reviving initiation rituals. In this garage in Detroit, men get together to fix cars. There is no government grant funding it, there's no sensitivity training, no politics, no HR department monitoring their speech.
It's just shared purpose, competence, and mutual respect.
Right. Riker argues we desperately need to revive these rites of passage. Men need to be tested by hardship to mature into adults.
He contrasts that garage environment with the bubble-wrapped classrooms of the modern university.
Exactly. Because you cannot become a man if you are protected from every minor discomfort. If you need a coloring book because a visiting speaker upset you, you aren't an adult.
And Riker says the ultimate weapon for these men, once they toughen up, is logic. He points to the trivium grammar, logic, and rhetoric as the essential toolkit for the red-pilled man.
He says we need to use cold, hard logic to dismantle the word salad. When someone throws a buzzword at you like equity or microaggression or patriarchy, you do not apologize.
You analyze it. You ask them to define their terms.
And usually, as that Stanford BLM study showed, they can't. They crumble when pressed for definitions. Riker encourages the listener to stand firm. He says the zombies can be unplugged, but only if men stop apologizing for reality.
Stop apologizing for reality. That really is the core message of the whole manual, isn't it? Stop accepting the premise that you, as a man, are the problem.
It is. He argues that civilization isn't being murdered by some shadow cabal in a dark, smoky room. It's being murdered by a bankrupt ideology that we simply tolerate. We let it happen because we are afraid of being called names.
And Riker says, let them call you names. Let them call you whatever they want. Stand your ground. It is a call to reclaim the good, the true, and the beautiful, to restore the values that built the West in the first place.
It's a comprehensive argument. Looking at the scope of this book, from the Frankfurt School in Marcuse through the modern dating apocalypse, all the way to that Detroit garage, it's a massive wake-up call for Western men. It really is a field manual for taking your life back.
And speaking of waking up and taking action, Riker has a lot more content for those of you who want to go deeper. He urges listeners to follow him on Substack at Conrad and Riker.
That's where he posts his ongoing analysis and breaks down current events through this exact lens. He is very active there. And again, if you want the full field manual, and believe me, we really only scratch the surface of the charts and data he presents, you need to buy the book.
Yeah, make sure to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books for Suicide of Western Civilization. It is definitely a read that will arm you with the arguments Riker believes are necessary to fight back. It's not a comfortable read, but it's a necessary one if you want to understand the perspective of the manosphere and this deep critique of modern culture.
Absolutely. And before we sign off today, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own. We've talked a lot about the institutions, the schools, the corporations, but building on Riker's point about the language war, what if the real measure of this civilizational suicide isn't in the institutions at all, but in the sheer amount of silence from the average person?
That's a great point.
Ask yourself how many times you self-censored just today, at work or online, or even with your family. If Riker is right, the front line isn't in Washington or on a college campus. It's in your own head before you even speak. What happens if millions of men just decide to stop biting their tongues tomorrow?
Now that is something to chew on. Can you stand up to the mob with just a question? Are you ready to stop apologizing?
It is the ultimate test of character.
All right, that wraps up this ultra-long deep dive. If you got value out of this discussion, if you want us to keep exploring these critical topics and reviewing books that the mainstream absolutely ignores, please like and subscribe to the show. It makes a huge difference for us.
Stay strong, read the source material, and don't let the language war defeat you.
See you on the next deep dive.